The rain had been falling since morning, slow, steady, and without mercy. The kind of rain that didn't cleanse anything, just made the world heavier. Beneath a trembling bus shelter sat Amara Johnson, a young black woman of 21, her eyes tired yet somehow bright. Her faded brown coat clung to her shoulders like a forgotten promise. Water dripped from her curls, sliding down to the frayed collar of her blouse. Her shoes, the same pair she'd worn for nearly 3 years, squelched softly with every shift of her feet. But Amara smiled anyway. She always did not, because life gave her reasons, but because she refused to stop giving herself hope. The city roared around her, engines splashing through puddles, neon lights trembling on slick asphalt, voices echoing from crowded cafes where warmth was taken for granted. Amara sat with a small brown bag in her lap inside, the leftover bread from her cleaning shift at the bakery. It wasn't much, but it would last her through the night. She tore a piece of it, watching pigeons hop between puddles nearby. They, too, looked tired of pretending to be okay. When she looked up at the gray sky, something in her eyes seemed to whisper a prayer that words couldn't hold. "God," she murmured softly, "I don't need riches. I just don't want to feel invisible anymore." Her voice barely rose above the rain. A bus screeched past, spraying her skirt with muddy water. She winced, then laughed quietly to herself. That was Amara, poor, unseen, but always finding a reason to smile. She gathered her things and began walking through the park, the same park she crossed every evening on her way back to her small rented room at the edge of town. Trees bowed low under the weight of raindrops, their leaves trembling with silver light. The air smelled of wet earth and forgotten dreams. Then she saw her. On the far bench, beneath an umbrella that had collapsed in the rain, sat an old woman, hunched, motionless, her pale hands trembling, her face hidden behind strands of silver-white hair. Even from afar, Amara felt something inside her stir. There was something haunting about the stillness of that figure, like grief, frozen in time. She hesitated. The woman didn't move. Her handbag lay open beside her, a handkerchief soaked through, her eyes fixed on something invisible, something lost. Amara glanced down at her bread, then back at the woman. Her heart whispered before her mind could catch up. Go to her. She crossed the puddles carefully, raindrops glistening on her lashes. When she reached the bench, she saw tears tracing lines down the woman's wrinkled cheeks, merging with the rain. Her breathing was shallow, fragile. "Ma'am," Amara said softly, "are you all right?" The woman didn't look up at first. Her lips trembled, trying to form words. Then she whispered, "It hurts so much. And I have no one left." Her voice cracked on the last word. Amara's chest tightened. Without another thought, she took off her shawl, thin and threadbare, and wrapped it gently around the woman's shoulders. "I don't have much," she said, smiling through the cold, "but warmth feels better when shared." The old woman blinked, startled. Her eyes, a pale gray that once must have been sharp and proud, met Amara's. For the first time, she spoke clearly. You're very kind, child. Why would you help a stranger?" Amara sat beside her, ignoring the rain soaking her skirt. "Because I know what it feels like to cry alone," she said simply. "And no one deserves that." The woman's lips trembled, then broke into a faint smile. Rain continued to fall, but somehow it didn't feel so cold anymore. The rain slowed to a whisper as the city's heartbeat softened. Distant thunder rolled over the skyline, not in anger, but in weary resignation. The park, emptied of joggers and laughter, belonged to only 2 souls now. One young, one old. The old woman shivered beneath Amara's shawl, clutching her handbag close. Her fingers were elegant but thin, the kind that once wore jewels and signed letters on expensive stationery. Now, they trembled like dry leaves. "You shouldn't sit here in the rain," Amara said gently. "There's a cafe across the street. I can get us tea." The woman shook her head. "No, I can't leave yet." Her voice was distant, almost lost in memory. "Are you waiting for someone?" The woman looked out toward the empty park path, eyes glassy, fixed on a bench across the way. "Yes," she whispered. "My son." Amara frowned softly. "Will he be long?" The woman smiled a broken smile. "He's been late for 27 years. The words struck Amara like a stone dropped in still water. Margaret's eyes filled again, but these were not new tears. They had been waiting a lifetime to fall. "I come here every year," she said. "This was our place." He loved the rain, said it washed away pain. He was wrong, though. It only hides it. Amara didn't interrupt. She listened the way the world never did fully, without pity. She offered the old woman her bread, and after a hesitant pause, Margaret accepted it with trembling gratitude. "I don't even know your name." "Child," she said. Amara Johnson." "Beautiful name." Margaret smiled faintly. "Means grace, doesn't it?" Amara nodded. "My mother said she wanted me to be a reminder that kindness still exists." Margaret's eyes softened. "She must be proud." Amara's voice lowered. "She's gone now. Heart illness took her last winter." The silence that followed was gentle, the kind that only exists between two people who have known real loss. Rain dripped from the branches above, a rhythmic prayer of its own. After a moment, Margaret reached for her handbag, pulling out an old photograph. The edges were worn, the color faded, but the image was clear, a young man in uniform, smiling with pride. "This was him," she said. "My William." Amara studied the picture. The man's eyes had the same pale gray light as hers. "He looks kind," she whispered. "He was my whole world," Margaret said softly. "One rainy evening, just like this, he left home to drive to a meeting. A drunk driver ran a red light. They told me he died instantly, but I still feel him sometimes, like he's sitting right here beside me." She placed her hand on the empty space of the bench. Amara followed her gaze, and for a fleeting moment she swore she saw the outline of someone there, shimmering faintly through the rain. Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "His father couldn't bear it. He threw himself into work, built an empire, they said. But I lost both of them that day. The house grew too big. The room's too quiet. So I come here. Every year. I talk to the rain, and I hope maybe the wind carries my words to wherever he is." Amara's throat tightened. She wanted to comfort her, but words seemed so small against pain that old. So she simply placed a hand on Margaret's and said, "Maybe the rain doesn't carry your words away. Maybe it brings him closer." Margaret looked at her, startled, then smiled through tears. "You have a gift, child. Your heart speaks poetry." Amara blushed softly. "I just say what feels true." For a while neither spoke. The rain quieted completely. The park glowed under lamplight, and somewhere a nightbird sang not for sorrow, but for peace. The clouds began to part, and faint traces of moonlight slipped through. The park, moments ago gray and lifeless, now shimmered with silver reflections on the pavement. It felt like the sky itself had paused to listen. Amara noticed Margaret shiver again. She unwrapped the last piece of her bread, broke it in half, and handed it to her gently. "Eat this. You shouldn't stay hungry. You need your strength." Margaret looked down at the small offering and then back at Amara, her lips trembling with disbelief. "When was the last time someone did something kind for you?" Amara asked quietly. Margaret smiled sadly. "I can't even remember, my dear. The world forgot me a long time ago." Amara's voice softened, carrying the weight of generations of pain and resilience. "Then tonight, the world remembers." She pulled her shawl tighter around the old woman's shoulders, patting her hand as if she were her own grandmother. The moment was pure, unforced, the kind of moment the universe notices. The old woman studied her, eyes narrowing with wonder. "Who raised you to be this kind?" "My mother," Amara said. "Even when we had nothing, she'd say, 'Kindness doesn't cost, it multiplies.' I didn't understand it then. But I do now." Margaret's gaze dropped to Amara's wrist, where a small thread bracelet, faded and frayed, hung loose. "Did she give you that?" Amara nodded. "She tied it before she passed. Told me it would bring me to where I'm meant to be." The old woman's eyes glistened again, this time not from pain, but from recognition, as if something in Amara's voice unlocked a door she thought long sealed. "I believe you, my dear," Margaret said softly. "And I think maybe we were meant to meet tonight." Amara smiled, though she didn't yet understand how true those words would become. The park seemed to hold its breath that night, as if the trees themselves were keeping vigil for something too fragile to name. Amara sat very still, the shawl heavy across Margaret's thin shoulders, and listened while the old woman unfolded the long business of her years, not as a list of sorrows, but as a map of what had shaped her. Margaret's voice was low and practiced at first, the kind of voice that tells old stories so often the edges have been softened by repetition. But as she moved deeper into the memory, the tone changed, caught on an invisible splinter, raw and immediate. "My William," she began, and the name fell like the opening note of a hymn. He was the sort of boy who believed the world could be won with a little courage and a lot of stubbornness. Tall for his age, laughing like sun on water, he could charm the birds down from the branches, and he'd bring them breadcrumbs till they followed him home. Amara could see him in her mind, a young man with a smile that arrived before his words. There was something universal about that image, the promised future that a child carries in the warmth of a mother's eyes. He had plans, Margaret said, plans that sounded too big for our small house. He wanted to study, to build things that mattered. He wanted to travel. I used to tell him to be careful, and he would grin and promise me the moon. The last thing he said before he left that night was, "Mama, don't worry. I'll be home before the rain finishes its song." Amara watched her fingers wrap and unwrap the photo she'd shown earlier. The man in it looked to the world like a soldier, steady and proud. But now his face was a portrait of what never arrived, a life interrupted, a book closed in mid-sentence. They called in the paper what they always call it, tragic accident, Margaret went on, a bitter edge to the phrase. They said the driver was intoxicated, that the judge did what judges do, and then they said time would heal. Time is a liar. It teaches you to hide your tears until they have become part of your bones. She laughed then, a thin, surprising sound. People bring casseroles. They cluck their tongues. They leave bouquets on the step, and they go home to their dinners. The world rearranges itself around the empty chair. His father. He buried himself under ledgers and board meetings and became a man the paper called magnate. He said he had to do it for us, to be stronger. The house kept getting bigger. The photographs on the walls kept getting richer frames. But the house is a theater. The furniture is the only audience to the silence. There was an ache in her voice that made Amara's chest ache in response. How many lives were composed of these small catastrophes, moments that others called hardship, but which to those who lived them were seismic, world-breaking events? "But I still come," Margaret continued, staring at the empty slice of bench beside her. "I come because the day he went, the rain was very particular, gentle in the beginning, then unrelenting. I thought perhaps if I sat where things had once been whole, I might hear his footsteps somehow, as if the earth decided to be generous. People think I'm daft. Maybe I am. But I am nothing but love left. So I bring bread. I bring the memory." Amara could feel the landscape of Margaret's life fit into her own understanding of small mercies. There was a kinship in grief. She had lost a mother as well. And though the scale differed, a death in a house of marble versus a death in a one-room apartment, the shape of the ache was familiar. Loss had that way of flattening the world into an urgent question, who bears your absence for you? Margaret turned the locket that hung around her neck. It glittered despite the rain, a diamond sun in miniature. The initials engraved upon it, W.M., were delicate, meaningful in a way that did not require explanation. "My William's locket," she said. He always wore it as if the weight of the world sat on a chain. "When the accident came, I kept it close. I slept with it under my pillow for months. Sometimes I'd wake and press it to my lips and imagine I could taste his laughter. It's small consolation, but it's a thing I can hold." Amara leaned closer, letting the conversation wrap them both in a private circle. Did he ever come and sit here with you?" she asked. Margaret's eyes darkened. "No. He said the park was childish. He said there were meetings he could not miss. Money became a thing that could be measured by the square footage of a ballroom. But love isn't measured in meters, it's a frequency." It occurred to Amara then, sudden and sharp, that sometimes wealth doesn't buy peace. It buys distance. It buys appointments and delegations and the kind of exhausted practicality that convinces a person they are honoring grief by ignoring it. The irony was brutal and simple. The man who could have cradled his own grief apparently chose to be numb to it. The old woman placed the photograph back into her handbag with a trembling care, like tucking a bird back into its nest. Her eyes searched Amara's face with an intimacy that made the young woman feel both honored and exposed. "You did something tonight that most people forget how to do," Margaret said. "You sat, you listened, you offered bread. The world thinks such things are small, but they are not small. The tiniest flare of kindness can be an entire lighthouse to someone lost at sea." Amara swallowed. "I didn't think you did." Margaret's fingers tightened for a moment. "I cannot explain why I feel a certain lightness, Maybe it's foolish to believe in signs, but I have always kept my faith in the small ones. Outside, the rain's rhythm changed, as if it were tapping a new measure. A wind moved through the trees, lifting the shawl and playing at the edges. Somewhere in the city, a clock chimed the hour. Time, despite being a liar, kept insisting on moving forward. The two women sat in companionable silence for a spell. Amara felt something seed into her chest, like a new word she had not yet learned to say. Purpose. It was a gentle thing, not yet formed as an ambition or plan, but as something purer, the sense that her small acts could ripple, and that the mercy she had shown might one day arrive back as a blessing she couldn't yet imagine. Margaret's gaze lingered on Amara, and for a second she looked not like a stranger but like a guardian who'd recognized her. "My William used to say that the world could be changed by the steadiness of a kind heart," she murmured. "If that is true, then maybe tonight a small change has begun." Amara's reply was a whisper. "If kindness saves lives, then this city would be full of them." They both smiled through the rain, one smile worn by time, the other bright with a stubborn hope, and the bench seemed, for a moment more than most, saturated with an unlikely grace. After Margaret's story settled into the quiet between them, Amara's curiosity took the shape of small, careful movements. She had always been the curious sort, not in the prying way people sometimes meant when they used that word, but in the way that gently rearranges the world to see if pieces might fit together more kindly. Her hand drifted to Margaret's locket, drawn by something like reverence rather than theft. The initials WM shimmered beneath a thin veil of rain. When Amara tilted the pendant, a faint inscription caught the moonlight, a thin script at the back that was almost invisible at first. "What does it say?" she asked, voice softer than the rustle of wet leaves. Margaret blinked, as if she'd never been asked that line of her life's little map. "It's just his initials," she said. "William Moore." Something in the name lodged in Amara's mind like a seed. Moore. The name had the steady clatter of an old house door shutting, familiar, historic. She had heard Moore before. It was a name that could belong to a corner shop or a corporation, to a friendly neighbor or a man with 100 rooms. Amara tilted the locket more, and with her free thumb she managed to pry open the tiny clasp. Inside, pressed flat against the back, was a faded slip of paper. It was not a note in the ordinary sense. It looked more official: an address, an embossed stamp, a number she could hardly read. She swallowed and glanced up. Margaret watched her hand with an expression that made the night feel suddenly taut. "You should not—" Margaret began, then stopped herself. Her voice slipped into a different register. "But the years have been heavy, and perhaps the truth needs air." Amara's fingers hovered. She had expected trinkets, perhaps a lock of hair or a pressed flower. An address felt heavy, like a key found in a coat pocket that might unlock a door you had closed. The ink was smudged, but the first line became legible if she leaned in close. "Wellington House, 114 Pembroke Way." The second line was a name fine, inked in an elegant hand. "Moore and Sons Office of David Moore." Amara felt the room of her life tilt. Moore and Sons. The magnitude of that phrase did something to the air, like someone had turned a low oven flame up and the house began to smell different. "Moore and Sons?" she said aloud. "Like a company?" Margaret nodded slowly. "His husband William's father was a businessman long before I knew any of the suits. He had a presence. People listen when he speaks. He called himself a builder of things." She touched the locket as if it were a sacred stone. They never were cruel to him, they just moved their grief into schedules. Amara felt a complicated mixture of fascination and trepidation. The locket was no longer a small, tender relic of a family tragedy. It was the hinge to a far larger place. The presence of a surname that carried weight in the city meant that the stranger she had comforted might belong to a vast house of money and influence. It was both a revelation and a threat. The world of the wealthy often arrived like a tidal wave to small boats. "What would he do if he knew you were here?" Amara asked. Margaret's laugh this time was brittle. "He might be embarrassed, or he might be grateful, or he might have better manners than that and show no measure of either. The wealthy are complicated." Amara's mind made the leap she tried not to make. If this was indeed the family of a man who had built an empire, and his mother sat on a bench in the park once a year with a locket for comfort, then the story that had unfolded between them was a strange one indeed. In the city, fortunes could cushion an absence and make it less visible, but they rarely healed it. She wrapped her fingers around the locket for a second longer, feeling its cold against her palm. Inside the clasp, beneath the address, there was another mark, a tiny blue stamp she recognized from the envelope she'd seen at the post office. Wellington Trust. A plan unwound in Amara's mind, small and careful as the steps of a bird. She would find out who this family was, not for personal gain, but because the truth demanded to be known. The old woman had been reduced by grief to a ritual of waiting. Perhaps the proper thing was to remind the world in its grand houses and meetings that there was a heart on a park bench that remembered. Would you like me to look?" Amara asked, the question carrying more determination than she intended to show. Margaret's eyes shone with immediate gratitude. "Oh, child, if you could, I would be so grateful." And so a search was born, not the frantic kind born of the naive, but the deliberate, cautious kind that walks city blocks at dusk and talks to people who hold keys or memories. The fruit seller by the corner, the old paper boy who had moved his rounds near the park, the bus driver who always took the same route. Amara's search was not a parade. It was a set of small conversations stitched together by resolve. She learned that Wellington House was real, set on a quiet lane with iron gates and a fountain that tinkled like a crystal music. Moore & Sons had an office in Pembroke Way. The name David Moore came up with frequency, a man with a calm voice and sharp jaw, a man who gave speeches at charity dinners and whose portrait hung in the Civic Hall. He was called Billionaire in hushed tongues by some, and benefactor by others who wanted to believe in kinder labels. With each discovery, the world seemed to slide a shade more strange beneath Amara's feet. The bench where she'd found Margaret felt to her like a seam between two fabrics of the city, the visible and the gilded. She kept the locket safe inside her pocket, close to her heart, the same way Margaret did. But the night had a thing for surprises. It would not allow secrets to sleep for long. The park had grown quieter still by the time Amara rose to leave. Her mind held a map of names and addresses like a private litany. Wellington House, Pembroke Way, David Moore. The night air felt brittle and cold, as though the city itself suspected that something was amiss. Margaret nudged the shawl tighter, and Amara rose to help her adjust it. The old woman's hands were cold as river stones, but her eyes were alive with gratitude. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said, startling Amara with the intensity of it. "Some people do not like the past unearthed." Amara laughed, trying to make her voice light. "I'll be careful," she promised. The word felt both small and brave in the dark. Amara walked with Margaret to the park's gate, then turned toward the lane leading to her rented room. The locket pressed against her ribs like a secret heartbeat. She thought perhaps she would make one more visit in the morning, call a number she'd found at the post office, ask questions in polite ways. There were, she felt, kindnesses that required patience. She did not reach the corner before the world folded. A cart clattered into the street with a flurry of pigeons, and when Amara blinked, the bench was empty. She stopped as if someone had removed the ground beneath her. Margaret's shawl was still on the bench, curling in the puddles like a small stranded ship. The handbag lay on its side, the photograph peeking free from its seam. But the woman herself, the woman who had been there a moment earlier, who had laughed and told stories and tucked a memory into Amara's heart, had vanished, as though the rain had swallowed her whole. For a second, Amara thought the park might be playing a trick. Perhaps Margaret had only gone to stand beneath a larger tree to keep from the wind. She walked around the bench, calling gently, "Margaret? Ma'am?" No answer. She ran to the nearest vendor, a man wrapping kebabs on a cart under an oil lamp. "Sir, have you seen an old lady with silver hair?" "She was sitting on the bench a moment ago." The man shook his head, eyes wary. "Miss, you must be careful. Strange people, they wander." "Please," Amara insisted, swallowing the panic that had begun like a bird beating inside her chest. She asked the kiosk clerk, the street sweeper, the old man who sleeps near the fountain. Each answer was the same. "No, miss, no sign." At the far edge of the park, a child pointed to a small path leading toward the station. "She walked that away," the child said. "I saw her like she was in a hurry." Amara followed, heart picking up pace. She walked the path, calling the woman's name until her voice was a raw thread. The night swallowed her shouts. The station was empty, the trains humming through without stopping for sorrow. Back at the bench, Amara found the locket still there, half buried in a shallow puddle, catching the lamplight like a tiny beacon. She picked it up, pressing it to her palm. The metal felt colder than it had before, and for a second she imagined Margaret's cheek against it, the way a mother leans against a child. She looked up and down the lane, uncertain, a map with a missing landmark. Then, while she was still deciding what to do next, a man in a dark suit appeared from the shadow of an alley, as if summoned by the night. He was not the sort of person who belonged to the park or to its vendors. He wore a coat that smelled faintly of cedar and a watch that caught the light with precise authority. He carried with him a posture that suggested he belonged to a world of appointments and addresses. "You found her locket," he said, not a question. His voice was quiet and efficient. Amara's hand went to the locket where it rested in her palm like a small sun. "Do you know her?" He looked at the locket, then at Amara. For a moment his expression softened with something like astonishment. "She's Margaret White," he said. "She comes here sometimes. She's delicate. I'm William Moore." The name landed strange and sharp in Amara's ears like the corner of a new room. "I work for the Moore family." Amara's mouth opened. "Moore? William Moore?" He nodded curtly. "Yes. My name is William Moore, Jr. I'm a field investigator for the family. I take care of certain matters that require discretion." The blood drained from Amara's face and then rushed hot with a dozen questions. "Do you mean David Moore?" "David Moore is her son." The man's jaw tightened and then loosened in a practiced way. "Mrs. White is related to the Moore family, yes. The details are complicated." He stepped closer, and Amara sensed the careful diplomacy in every movement. "Where did you meet her?" "In the park near the second bench," she stammered. "I gave her my shawl. We talked. She told me about William, her son. She left her locket behind, and I was looking for her when she disappeared." William Moore, Jr., who introduced himself with the name William, only after a pause, looked at the bench, then at the photograph protruding from the handbag. "This is her," he said. He reached out, taking the photograph with the gentleness of a man who had been taught to handle fragile things correctly. "Do you have a phone?" he asked suddenly. Amara handed him her small, cracked screen phone. He tapped it with a thumb that suggested the years had not dulled his efficiency. "I'll contact the family," he said. "We have protocols when someone like Mrs. White goes missing." "Missing?" The word broke across the air like thin glass. She didn't seem, "I know." William Moore, Jr. folded the photograph, placing it back into the handbag with an almost ceremonial care. "She has gone off before. Sometimes she returns to Wellington House. Sometimes she disappears for days and then turns up at the little church down the road. We've tried to keep her safe." Amara's confusion doubled into alarm. Why didn't they bring her home?" "We tried," William said. "But she refuses help when it comes with a guard with a limo with watchful eyes. She sits where she remembers where it was simple once. She will not be commanded into a carriage of convenience." There was a worn patience in his voice that suggested he'd rehearsed the explanation to the point it had become comforting to him. Amara hugged the locket to her chest. "I just want to make sure she's okay." William regarded her levelly for a long beat, then inclined his head. "Then you did a good thing tonight. You gave her what she needed." He looked at the locket, then back to Amara with something like a tentative gratitude. "Would you come with me to the Moore residence tomorrow? We would like to speak to you. There are things about her life that we have not been able to reconcile." He hesitated. "She remembers things differently." Amara felt a strange combination of elation and dread. The locket in her palm seemed suddenly heavier with possibility. "All right," she said, voice steady though her legs trembled. "I'll come." William Moore, Jr. nodded, then straightened, the picture of composed industry. "Good. I'll have a car pick you up. We want to ensure you're safe. Please don't wander the streets alone tonight." He folded his hands in front of him as if to say, "You are not alone now." Amara watched him move away, a man of careful business disappearing into the night like a stagehand after the most crucial scene. The park seemed smaller now, like a room after the furniture had been rearranged. The locket pulsed faintly against her palm as if in agreement. She stayed where she was until the first train rumbled past the distant station. The city hummed its desultory lullaby. People in warm apartments looked out at a rain-washed world and turned away. In the stillness, Amara pressed her forehead to the cool metal of the locket and made a promise, half to herself, and half to the woman who had shared bread and stories with her. "I will come," she whispered. "I will be there until the truth is kinder." The city at night is a different creature than the city by day. It wears its secrets in quiet alleys and under flickering neon, and it hums with the small lights of people who are awake with worry. For Amara, the park bench had become a compass point, a hinge between a memory and the possibility of a life she could not yet map. Once she had the locket in her pocket and the name Wellington House ringing like a new bell in her mind, she felt an obligation she could not ignore. It began as a whisper: "Find her. Make sure she is safe." She started where instinct and tenderness told her to start, back through the park, past the fountain, past the vendor who sold roasted chestnuts and hummed old songs under an oil lamp. He remembered the old woman. He had called her the one with the pearls, and nodded solemnly when she described Margaret. The vendor's face folded in concern. Then, in that practical way the poor often adopt, "What can we do?" He pointed Amara toward the north lane where a line of older apartment buildings kept nocturnal watch. Amara moved through the city like someone summoning courage with each shoe step. Her finger caressed the locket beneath her coat, now and then, counting time in the cool metal. She would ask questions, she told herself. She would not accuse. Questions asked with humility sometimes opened doors. At a dimly lit bus stop, a man that the city called Old Tom leaned forward, his cap worn thin at the brim. He sold small paper trinkets by day and stories by night. "Mrs. White?" he muttered when she mentioned the name. "Used to sit where the maples fall. She takes the 4:30 home sometimes, if she's in the mood." His voice had the rough sand of too many winters. "Do you know where she stays?" Amara asked, breath pluming in the cold. Tom scratched his chin. "She doesn't stay in any one place. Folks say the house on Pembroke is hers sometimes, but then she vanishes. Folks got plenty of talk, but not much truth. If she left the bench tonight, she likely went where her feet incline, the corner bakery, the mission up on Elm, or sometimes the old chapel near the river." Each answer sent Amara to another block, another person, another small pulse of hope that might puff out before she reached it. She asked a bus driver, who said he had seen an older woman step into a service taxi earlier, not the kind that a driver hailed, but the kind that came with a polite nod and a passcode. The driver's eyes flicked to Amara, and his mouth tightened with the knowledge that there were people who moved differently in this city. People with cars that smelled of lemon oil and polished leather. The wealthy had rhythms that the rest of the city could only chart in distant approximation. Amara kept walking until the stars had almost been swept from the sky by the glare of an industrial lamp. She climbed 2 flights of stairs to the building of a seamstress who knew every pattern of garment in the neighborhood and remembered faces like treasured stitches. The seamstress had seen Margaret once, she said, at a funeral of a neighbor who had known better days. She described Margaret's poise even in sorrow, the way grief made someone both smaller and more particular. Time, however, was not a friend that could be hurried for this sort of searching. The city held its breaths and its secrets with the stubbornness of old trees. Amara's feet ached, but the ache was nothing compared to the hollow she had seen in Margaret's eyes that night. She thought of the photograph, and of the way that Maria, her own mother, used to say, "You must make kindness the order of your days." Tonight, kindness felt like a compass, and the compass demanded movement. She wandered to the old church by the river at nearly midnight. The church's doors were shut, but the night watchman sat in a booth, a cigarette between his fingers and a radio whispering old hymns. He remembered Margaret, too. "Good woman," he said. She sat once in the back pew and hummed to herself. "Sometimes she leaves little notes for no one." He pointed to a small alley behind the church, where lanterns sometimes burned through the night. The problem was never lack of leads. The problem was the shape of those leads, long and thin, like threads that had been cut and left askew. Amara followed each thin thread, but many tugged her to the edge of impossibility. She talked to a taxi dispatcher who kept a ledger of rides for wealthy clients. He listened and then leaned back. The ledger spread like a secret palm. "The Moore account uses coded names," he said. "They run under an alias, but you can trace the car by the plate if you wait. Sometimes the car stops at the West Market, sometimes at Wellington House. It's not for small folks to chase without trouble, miss. Trouble had a polite knock in this city. It didn't always come with threats, but sometimes with a cold bureaucracy that made people go home to their smaller rooms and pretend the world hadn't expanded toward them." But Amara wasn't content to pretend. She sat on an upturned crate next to the market until dawn bled into the east, and she watched license plates like a novice astronomer watches stars, patient and hopeful. When the first gray slice of morning lit the rooftops, she saw a black sedan with a silver crest slow by the market and then park near a hedge. A man in a tailored suit hopped out and lit a cigarette, his movements precise and practiced. The sedan's language was one of order. It did not belong to the neighborhood. Amara's heart began to hammer in her chest, like a bird frantic to leave a closed cage. She did not follow in the obvious way. She had seen enough of polite danger to know that overt curiosity sometimes returned blowback in unexpected currency. She trailed, keeping to shadowed alleys and the geometry of early morning vendors setting up. The suit man went through a short side gate, and Amara watched as a uniformed guard waved him through with familiarity. That gate led to Wellington House. Wellington House was not ostentatious. If it spoke in the refined dialect of old wealth-iron gates that had been tended like a private garden, a fountain that played like a small orchestra, hedges pruned into their own versions of restraint. The house knew how to be magnanimous and private. It had lamps that burned like soft eyes and curtains drawn like secrets. From the outside, it made the city's noise sound distant. Amara watched for hours from a bench across the lane. She saw footmen, couriers, a woman with a scarf that seemed to cost as much as her rent, and cars like black fish gliding in and out of the iron gate. The city passed like a procession. Morning joggers, dog walkers, an old man who read the paper facing the fountain. And then William Moore, Jr. emerged again, buttoning his coat like a man taking up a shield. Her heartbeat thrummed against her ribs with a steady drum of something between fear and expectation. There was a private choreography at Wellington House, and Amara was no member of that dance, but she also held the right of one who had existed on a bench and had offered a shawl. She had the right to ask a question if the day allowed it. When a woman in a neat uniform, a housekeeper, perhaps stepped out and handed a small parcel to a courier, Amara rose and walked across the lane with a certainty that made her toes tingle. "Excuse me," she said, to the courier who smelled faintly of tobacco and paper. "Do you work for Wellington House?" The courier regarded her with thin surprise. He was the world-weary sort who had seen storytellers aim for headlines and cynics aim for pity. "I deliver for a few houses," he said. "Why?" Amara opened her mouth, then closed it, pondering how to put the night in words without sounding like a child. "An elderly lady left her locket on a bench in the park last night. Her name is Margaret White. I was told she sometimes goes to Wellington House." The courier's expression softened, then hardened. "You should speak to the butler," he said finally, with the kind of authority that comes from a place of ordered knowledge. "He takes matters into hand. House rules, you know." Amara nodded, feeling the polite boundary of a world she had not yet been invited into. When she said Margaret's name, there was always that flicker in people like a small lamp being briefly turned on. It made her think of the way things connected if only someone would pull the right thread. She left a note with the courier, her name, her number, the locket in question, and then walked back toward the park. The day had become a thin sound of traffic and birds. Her feet were sore, and a new sort of tired had crept into her bones, the kind that belonged to people who had given and had not yet received. Her search that night, which had become morning, had not returned Margaret into her arms, but it had carried her to the threshold of something larger, the realization that the woman on the bench belonged, ineluctably, to a house with rooms that were bigger than most people's lives. It also gave her a name with teeth David Moore, and a faint but terrible knowledge that names sometimes carried storms on their backs. When she finally walked home, the city was waking in earnest. Bakers were hauling loaves, milk carts bobbed like sleepy boats, and the gossip of the morning had already begun to crawl out of doorways. Amara went to her small room, lay the locket on the bed, and watched the metal catch the morning's first honest light. It looked different now, like something that could open an entire set of doors, or close them. She slept only a few hours before a knock came at her door, and a voice exact and proper, with a tone like well-kept ledger paper, said, "Miss Johnson? A car is outside to take you to Wellington House." The search had, at least for now, yielded a pathway. Amara felt the city turn under her like a wheel. She picked up the locket and smoothed the shawl's memory in her mind. Whatever the house's reasons, whatever the family's shape, she thought of the bench and the hush of the park and the way the woman's voice had sounded when she had said, "Kindness doesn't cost. It multiplies." She took a breath as though to steady a small ship. The search had only begun to show its map. The car smelled faintly of leather and citrus, a smell that to Amara suggested other people's care, neat and deliberate. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded against the locket, the fabric of her coat damp at the collar. The driver, a man with quiet competence behind the wheel, folded his gloved hands and offered no small talk. The city slid by the window in a procession of peeling posters and storefronts that had not known the Moore family's private rituals. Amara's stomach had the low hum of someone tethered to an unknown future. The sedan moved through streets she knew only by name. The houses here had hedges and doormen, and the air smelled different, like citrus and polished wood. The absolute neatness of it made Amara's pulse beat a little faster. She thought of her own small room, the peeling wallpaper, the kettle that whistled too long when it boiled, the single-thread bracelet her mother had tied around her wrist, and felt the strange, bittersweet tug of two lives passing on parallel tracks. When the car pulled into the gravel circular drive of Wellington House, the sight of the mansion took her breath like the first sharp note of a symphony. It rose into the morning sky like a well-carved promise, a facade of stone and high windows, ivy practiced like a careful hairstyle. It was not ostentatious. It simply had an opinion about taste and kept to it. A footman took her coat and hung it as if it had been a ceremonial garment. He addressed her politely, with an accent that sounded as though it had been pressed into the fabric of his speech long ago. "Miss Johnson, Mr. William Moore is expecting you in the study." The study was a room that wore history like a comfortable suit. Leather-bound books lined shelves that climbed to a ceiling. Honeyed light settled into corners like contentment. One could imagine the study as the place where decisions are whispered before they become law. A fireplace held a small, steady flame, though the morning carried little chill. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Portraits watched, polite and unblinking. There, a man who carried himself like a man who had been built to lead waited. He was not massive, but he had weight, the kind of gravity that makes other people straighten unconsciously. His hair was the color of slate. His jaw was clean and practiced. He removed a pair of glasses and regarded Amara with the sort of careful curiosity that does not insult, but does observe. "Miss Johnson," he said with the calm currency of a man used to being recognized. His voice was warm but measured. "I'm David Moore." The name tightened like a tune Amara had heard in hurried whispers, now played in living space. It was one thing to see Wellington House across a lane, and another to stand in the room where his shadow had been measured by others like weights on a scale. "You found my mother's locket," David said without preface, though his tone held no accusation. "William said you had a kindness to her." Amara felt her throat constrict. The furniture of the room all seemed to lean in, as if the house itself were curious about what a poor girl might say in response to a man whose life had been layered in gilding and committees. I only sat with her," Amara said, the words folding out of her like small paper birds. She left the bench in the locket. "I did not mean to intrude." David watched her, his eyes softening in a manner that was complicated and almost shy. "You did not intrude. You offered her what she needed. We haven't been very good at seeing the simple things." He paused as though choosing his phrase with care. "We, my family, have been good at arranging comfort in ways we think are proper. We sometimes forget that comfort can be as small as a shawl and as quiet as someone who listens." The admission seemed to be heavy on him, like a small confession. He extended his hand across a low table, not in a business manner, but in a simple human reach. Amara had the fleeting sensation of a house opening and offering the space inside its walls as a place of quiet. The gesture was strangely intimate. David's presence did not feel like a threat. It felt like a complicated tree, rooted, long-lived, and sometimes shedding branches that no longer fit. "Please sit," he said. "Tell me about her." Her words in that room carried an amplified dignity simply because they were being heard by someone who, by virtue of his name, had the power to effect change. She told him the small things, how Margaret had smiled at the bread, how she kept the shawl close, the way she mentioned William and the rainy night like it had been a map she'd traced for years. David listened with a quiet concentration that made her feel like the story mattered in itself. When she mentioned the locket and the address inside, his expression shifted like the weather. He removed his glasses, polished them as if that action could clarify more than glass. "My mother," he began slowly, "has loved the city in ways that made her stubborn in grief. She never liked being watched. which is perhaps why she never settled into the safety nets we offered. She's proud in ways that make pride a kind of armor. We thought that building rooms and buying comfort could replace the child we lost. We were wrong. Amara felt the shape of the family emerge not as an accusation but as a shared failing. David's voice had the warmth of remorse. He went on to say, with the humility of a man who had watched life from a stage, that there had been attempts to bring Margaret home, to surround her with medical comforts and discreet care. She would accept none of it if it smelled of obligation or if it came with the cold watchfulness of a guard. We were probably afraid to see the woman she had become in the absence of what she loved, he admitted, and for that I am sorry. There was a tenderness to his apology that made Amara see him as less a figure of power and more a person layered in regret. The study shivered only slightly with the gravity of the confession. It felt like a landing for the truth. After a pause, David stood and fetched a small box from a drawer. He opened it for her, revealing a medal that matched the kind found in the photograph Margaret had shown. "Your mother told me stories about someone who shared bread on sad days," he said. "She mentioned a girl once. She called her a reminder." Amara felt a heat on her cheeks. The room's air seemed to fold around her like a soft cloak. David continued, "We would like to thank you, not for what you did that was between two people, but for making sure she left nothing behind and for being the cause of a memory turning bright." "Thank me?" Amara echoed. She had not come for thanks. She had come because a woman had been lonely, because a locket carried a map that might lead someone home. But the gratitude from a man like David Moore had a hush to it that made her think of bell chimes and the way church steps felt on winter mornings. "We would like to offer something to you," he said. "A place at our foundation for young people, a scholarship for study, perhaps assistance where you need it. We insist on doing right by those who have hearts like yours." Amara's instinct was to refuse. Pride, after all, can be as stubborn as grief. But she thought of her mother's words, "Make kindness the order of your days." If accepting help meant she could help others in turn, then perhaps to accept was to keep the cycle alive. "May I tell my mother?" David asked gently. "She will be grateful to meet you." Amara nodded. She felt the hum of something like destiny in the air, the sense that small acts fold into larger things in ways that do not always make sense in the moment. She had come to return care. She left finding that the world sometimes answers in larger measures than one expects. As she prepared to leave, David pressed a hand briefly to the locket she'd kept folded in tissue, his fingers steady, reverent. "We will look after her," he promised. Outside, the garden glimmered and the city traffic hummed like a distant sea. Amara stepped into a world that felt subtler and stranger, as if she had crossed a river by plank and discovered the other shore to be different soil. For now the house had opened a gate to understanding, but it had not yet revealed every room. She left Wellington House with a mind full of new considerations, the complexity of wealth and grief, the strange ways that people shelter pain, and the small, stubborn power of an honest act. That a shawl and a piece of bread could open doors that 1,000 polite invitations could not. What followed the study was not a sudden curtain lift of revelations, but rather a carefully staged sequence of offers and explanations. Houses like Wellington have rehearsals for their truth-telling. They prefer apologies with schedules and reconciliations with forms. David Moore, despite his grandeur, navigated the moment with an evident desire to do the right thing by a woman who had offered warmth to his mother. After the initial conversation, David led Amara through corridors lined with family portraits. Each painting seemed to watch her with curious eyes, as if they were inventorying the exchange for historical record. Servants moved like punctuation marks, efficient, nearly invisible, but necessary to the rhythm of the house. They stopped at a paneled room that smelled faintly of citrus and paper. David sat down, offered her a cup of tea that steamed in delicate spirals, and set a small card on the table. On it, the name of the Moore Philanthropic Foundation occupied the top in tasteful script. Underneath, there were positions listed: internship, scholarship, community liaison roles that sounded like doors opening onto a future of learning and stability. "We want to offer you an opportunity," David said. "Not a charity handout, but a chance to be part of something that changes lives. Your humility and the way you listened are exactly the qualities we want in someone who helps us build a program for the elderly and lonely. We think you would be a natural." Amara felt the morning sun filter through the tall window and settle across the table like a small benediction. She could have said yes impulsively, swept up by gratitude and relief. Instead, she listened to the edges of the offer, what they expected, the commitments, the ways the foundation measured impact. "It's not the money I need most," she heard herself say. "I need the ability to learn, to help others the way I helped Mrs. White. If accepting this means I can do that, then I would like to. But I will not be the kind of person who settles for appearances." David's face softened. "We would not ask that of you. We want authenticity. We want people who remember why we do this." He paused. "We will arrange transportation, living stipend, and the chance to study with professionals we work with." It's a small beginning, but honest. It occurred to Amara that the offer contained a test, an invitation to a life strained differently than the life she had known. How would she wear new shoes in a world where rooms were measured by proportion, and time was scheduled by assistants? Would she bend under the difference or be strengthened by it? She thought of her mother's thread bracelet and of the bench in the park under the rain. Her thoughts moved like tide water. "If I do this," she asked, "will Mrs. White be safe?" David's fingers folded around the rim of his teacup. For a moment, he looked like a man reaching towards something larger than his own ego. "Yes, we will ensure she is safe. We will respect her wishes where possible, but provide a network of care. You will be part of that circle if you choose to be." Amara allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Safety was an ugly, understated currency, and in the small room with its library smell, she felt the economy of it shift gently in her favor. But the story had other small, hidden gears turning. William Moore, Jr., who had first found her in the park as a man of protocol and efficient calm, returned with papers and a tablet displaying images and dates. "We would like to ask you to tell us what you remember," he said. "Small details matter. The way she described her son, the phrase she used, these are pieces." Amara recounted the conversation as best she could, the photograph, his military air, the phrase about the rain, the way Margaret had hummed. She described the initials WM and the address. She described the locket's tiny blue stamp. Each detail was a bead on a string, and William Moore, Jr. threaded them with precise fingers. "We have gaps," he said finally. "Records that do not square with memory. Sometimes the world edits itself for the rich and organizes it for convenience. There may be reasons we missed. We need to reconcile them." His tone hinted at a professional curiosity that also seemed almost like a tenderness a man compelled. To set his employer's life in order so it might breathe again, David interjected with a softness. "We would like you to meet my mother, if you will. I do not expect you to think of us as anything but people who are learning. But if you would meet her and continue to be a presence in her life, it would mean a great deal." Amara's answer came quietly. "I will come, but I will not be a prop." The room held its breath. David chuckled softly, the sound of a man learning language new to his privilege. "We wouldn't ask that of you," he said warmly. "We want you as you are." There was a small ceremony to notify the household as to who she was and why she would become a presence in Margaret's life. A carriage was scheduled for the afternoon when David's schedule allowed. In the meantime, they offered her a room over the carriage house, a modest arrangement with a small bed and a view into the staff garden. It was not as small as Amara's previous room, but it was not the grandness of the main house either. It was, in its carefulness, a place to begin. Before she left the study, William Moore, Jr. asked a question that was practical and oddly personal. "Miss Johnson, would you be willing to tell us if there was anything in Mrs. White's manner that suggested she might return to the bench frequently? Likes and dislikes?" She thought of the way Margaret had tilted her chin to the rain, the way she had insisted on certain rituals, the way pride showed up. "She doesn't like being ordered. She likes small things that make her feel private. She likes bread, and she likes to keep a photograph near. She wants to remember things on her own terms." William nodded and jotted notes on his tablet with the industry of a man charting a course. "Thank you," he said. "We do our best. We will not intrude." When she left Wellington House for the day, walking back into the lane where the city had started to hum with afternoon, Amara felt both weight and lift in her chest. An offer had been made. A space opened. There were many kinds of movement in life, some that uproot and some that anchor. This felt like a bit of both. She had been given a chance to be in the company of people who might teach her, and also a chance to help a woman who had been abandoned by her son's absence and her family's architecture of care. She walked slowly, touching the locket tucked inside her coat as if to map the new territory. The city continued its business and did not appear to notice the small revolution that had begun on a rain-soaked bench. To most, the change would be invisible. To Amara and Margaret, however, the change was vast. The visitors offer the polite, well-compiled offer from a house that had once mistaken protection for suffocation was in its own way a miracle. Small, human things sometimes were. There are moments that start like small sparks and then, without the courtesy of warning, become bonfires. The revelation David Moore offered was not a single sudden blow. It arrived as a set of small facts threaded together until the picture they formed was too large to ignore. Amara sat in the study under the low ceiling of familial portraits as David and William Jr. unfolded details that felt, at once, like confession and explanation. "You must understand," David said carefully, leaning back in a leather chair that had seen more important conversations than this one. "Our family never meant to hurt her. We meant to protect what we thought was best." He rubbed his temple with a hand that showed the map of a life lived in schedules and obligations. After William's accident, the house changed. We compartmentalized grief into rooms, therapy appointments, physicians, compassionate assistants. We believed that structure would mend a heart that had been broken. We were wrong. William Jr., younger, precise, the man who had first found Amara in the rain, opened a slim folder and turned it so Amara could see. Inside were photographs, dates, and notes. There were letters their legal team had compiled, statements about guardianship, documents about property transfers. The language was sterile in its own kind of heartbreak. Dates, signatures, legalese. But tucked among the pages, highlighted in careful ink, was a line from a nurse's note, scrawled in a tired hand. "Mrs. White insists on visiting the park bench each anniversary. Says it keeps the shape of memory alive for her." Amara listened as if every word were a stone thrown into a pond, and she had to count the ripples to understand the size of what had happened. The mechanics of how one becomes estranged from what they love were in plain sight. Money could purchase consolation and convenience. It could not stitch seams across emptiness. In trying to protect a woman from pain, people with the means sometimes forget that pain and love are joined in a language no one can rewrite. "It was not always a matter of estrangement," William Jr. said. "At first, we thought bringing her into the house would be best. We built a suite, hired medical staff, provided a garden view, but she would not take it. She said the house was too loud with memory, that rooms with marble floors felt like theaters where grief was watched. She wanted to be ordinary in small ways that our industry of comfort could not manufacture." David folded his hands and looked at Amara with something like fresh humility. "She told me once years ago, shortly after the funeral, that she could not breathe inside a house full of photographs that looked like accusations. She said she wanted to grieve unmonitored, to taste the rain and remember the boy who promised the moon. That is how she ended up here and there and on the bench." Amara felt a fierce tenderness rise within her. The story of a poor black girl, as the world might phrase her in passing, who had comforted a crying old woman on a bench, was now colliding with the gravity of a family's private sorrow. The revelation was not the cheap drama some might expect. It was a painful truth about people who meant well and yet made choices that left an elder to find solace on a public seat. William Jr. continued, his voice softer now. "There is more. We discovered a discrepancy in some of the paperwork related to the estate a few months back. A trust disbursement was rerouted, and when we dug deeper, we found irregularities in a subset of documents that made us question whether someone inside the household was altering her intentions for their own ends. That's why we conduct background reviews. Why I'm asked to look after these matters. There are always complications when grief mixes with money." Amara traced a small circle on the polished table. picturing Margaret in the quiet of her bench, throat tight from years of waiting for a son who would not return. She thought of how simple it had been for her to offer bread and shawl actions without ledger lines. Now the revelations turned her small night of kindness into an entry on someone's list of incidents to be reconciled, something her mother might have called a bridge between private truth and public consequence. "Is anyone to blame?" Amara asked, voice soft. She did not want to point fingers. She wanted the truth so that the woman who had trusted her might be protected by something sturdier than excuses. David's eyes found the far window, where the city's day blurred into a painted smear. "Blame is awkward in this house. There are people who erred in judgment, certainly. There are people who thought they were acting out of care, and instead became instruments of isolation. There is also the impersonal machinery of institutions, doctors, lawyers, board members. Sometimes the machine takes a life's grief and catalogs it as a file." William Jr. tapped the pen on his folder, thoughtful. What matters now is reconciling what Margaret remembers with what the records say. She remembers William. She remembers a son who promised to return before the rain finished its song. The paper trail is messy. We want to know, did she ever call someone specific? Did someone visit? Did she have a keeper? The small details are what we need. Amara felt the locket in the small pocket of her coat like an ember. Small details were often the way the world remade itself for better or worse. She told them about phrases Margaret used, the way she insisted the rain had a sound and called him William more than my son. She recounted the detail about the bracelet on Amara's wrist and how Margaret's eyes lingered on it. "Bring her here tomorrow," William Jr. said suddenly, his professional voice touched with a personal note. "Let's have her stay in the guest suite for a meal." "No pomp, let us simply be present," David nodded. "We must give her space to remember on her terms and make room for whatever account she carries and make sure no one exploits her. If there is someone rerouting documents or claiming influence, we want to know. And if we need to make changes internally, we will." The revelation changed the tone of Amara's mission. It was no longer simply a private kindness. She was now an unwitting witness to a jagged line of events that connected a bench to a boardroom. The significance of her small gesture was literalized. The act of a poor black girl who had comforted a crying old woman had become a hinge on which a family might swing toward truth. When she left the study that evening, the light slanting low into the garden made the lawn look as if it had been painted with gold. Amara walked slowly, absorbing the revelation like a new vocabulary. She felt strangely honored and almost fearful, honored that this family trusted her presence, fearful that the truth when found might be too heavy for any one person to bear. She threaded the locket through her fingers and whispered the name Margaret had murmured into the rain. William. The word carried in its syllables the weight of a life and the possibility of justice. The revelation was not the end of the story, only the moment before its most honest unfolding. The day Margaret agreed to return to Wellington House, she walked in like someone carrying an entire lifetime in a small box. She arrived with a careful dignity that startled the staff into silence. An elegant presence in a simple, rain-spotted coat, eyes clearer than Amara had seen before, as if the purpose of the day had sharpened her. Amara escorted her inside, holding the small box of photographs and the locket wrapped in tissue. The house that had once seemed to belong to a different planet opened wider than before, letting in more air this time, perhaps softened by the revelations they had unearthed. There was no fanfare, no carriage procession. David had insisted on quiet, a simple meal, and the removal of any ornamental weight. Margaret's hands trembled only slightly as she passed the threshold. For a moment she paused in the entrance hall, as if receiving permission from the house itself to inhabit its rooms without apology. She then moved forward, eyes meeting portraits that had for years watched her as an offending memory rather than as a mother. Portraits of stern men and prim women regarded her with the neutrality of painted witnesses. David met her with an awkward grace. He did not rush to the hyperbolic displays sometimes reserved for reunion scenes. Instead, he offered a hand and a smile that contained both apology and relief. "Mother?" he said simply, the one syllable heavy with the years that stretched between them. Margaret's face softened as she recognized the voice. For a second, the house shrank, and the two of them were as they had once been a son and woman, speaking with the wardrobe of quieter days. She stepped forward and allowed him to take her hand. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was steadier, like the settling of two old timbers that had expanded and contracted for decades. They settled at a small table in a quiet corner of the dining room, where the light fell soft and forgiving. People who had served the house for years moved about with respectful tenderness, placing cups of tea and small plates of food. The domestic staff watched, complicit in their own way, in a scene that asked them to be gentle keepers of human reconciliation. Amara sat nearby, small in the scale of the room, but heavy in presence, the woman whose shawl had started the chain of events. She watched as David and Margaret took tentative steps toward each other, slow sentences that pulled at the raw stitches of a long absence. "Did you find the locket?" Margaret asked, voice small. Amara, who had her hand in her pocket where the locket had rested the night she first found it, drew it out and placed it gently on the table. The metal caught the lamplight and reflected a small, honest shine. Margaret's fingers hovered over it with a reverence that made Amara feel as if she were touching something sacred. "It was left on the bench," Amara said. "I brought it to your house so you wouldn't be alone with it any longer." Margaret smiled, and when she smiled, the years dropped away like fragile dust. "A child brought me bread and a shawl," she murmured. "For what that's worth to a woman like me, it was the moon." The conversation turned to small things: the weather, the state of the gardens, the old dog they once had that chased shadows. They spoke like people unclenching after a long hold. Sentences were short and plain, but each phrase carried enough meaning to feel like a stone set into a new wall. Later, in a quieter moment, William Jr. took Amara aside. "We had some oddities in our records," he said softly, as if the corridor itself demanded discretion. "There were transfers and signatures we couldn't parse. We are looking into who has access to certain accounts. The trust should never have been in such a shape that it could be diverted." Amara nodded. She had expected the house to be a place where truth unraveled slowly, with delicate hands. She was not surprised it took time and patience. But what surprised her was how naturally she fit, in a small way, into the rhythm of the house now, not as an ornament, but as someone who had offered a human truth and been received. As the afternoon waned, Margaret walked through the house's garden with Amara by her side. The hedges smelled of clipped leaves and distant roses. Children's laughter from a nearby street floated in the breeze as if the world outside wanted to help stitch things together. Margaret paused occasionally, touching petals, as if checking whether the world still knew how to be lovely. At one point she paused under a willow and turned to Amara, her voice catching with gratitude. "You gave me a moment I have been starving for," she said. "Not the kind with silver spoons or velvet chairs, the kind with quiet company. Thank you, child." Amara felt the well of humility and joy open in her chest. To have been the person to rebind this thin thread between a mother and the house her son had left behind felt like a miracle her mother had promised in bedtime prayers. Still, the day carried the soft tension of a book not yet concluded. While the reunion warmed the room, it did not yet resolve the gnawing questions regarding who might have been profiting from the cracks in the family's paperwork. That evening, David offered Margaret a small walk through the rooms where her son's photographs hung. He explained honestly the rituals they had instituted to keep her comfortable. She listened with the patience of someone who had learned to guard the heart by test and trial. At the end of the tour, she touched a particular portrait and whispered the name William as if testing its sound for size. Amara watched from the doorway and realized the meaning of her small act had rippled outward. The poor black girl, who had comforted a crying old woman, had become an unintended ambassador between the house and the bench. Margaret's presence in the mansion was not a solution. It was a continuation, a beginning of a conversation that would take time. But it was a start, and often a start is everything. There are reunions that are loud and performative, staged with cameras in the mind of their participants, and there are reunions that are quieter, stitched from the slow and honest cloth of presence. What happened when Margaret and David spent time in the house that afternoon belonged to the second kind. It was not a blaze of celebratory fireworks, but a deeping of something long neglected. They sat in the small parlor after tea, the light low and forgiving. The portrait gallery hummed at the edges, the faces in frames like sentries softened by age. David spoke with a clarity that came not from an oratory training but from the heart of a son who had spent years learning how to apologize. He told stories that were small and funny, facts only a family would share, that his father once tried to teach William to garden and failed spectacularly, that Margaret used to hum a particular tune while ironing. Margaret laughed at those small remembrances in a way that sounded like music. When she laughed, her shoulders dropped and for a few minutes her hands were steady. The room felt less like the stage of a tragic play, and more like a place where two people could notice each other again without defenses. At one moment, quiet as settling dust, David asked, "Do you remember the night before the accident? Anything that seems small that I might have missed?" Margaret's expression softened, and she considered the question as if tasting it. "He said to me, 'Mama, I'll be back before the rain finishes its song.' He kissed my forehead and left. It was ordinary in the way ordinary things are. I remember the sound of his boots on the steps. I remember thinking, stupidly, that it would be fine." David closed his eyes for a second and inhaled, a long breath that felt like an apology stretched thin and then tightened. "I wish I had been better at being present," he said, with an honesty that made the air between them feel fragile and true. That night, as they sat together, Margaret reached into her handbag and took out the faded photograph of William and placed it on the small table between them. David leaned forward, his fingers trembling just a little as he picked up the image. The photograph seemed to be both old and newly precious a rope that tethered grief to memory. "You loved him," David said, voice small and trembling. "You loved him more than anything." "I did," Margaret said simply. "I still do." The confession hung like a bell. Then something happened that no one in the room had announced or rehearsed. Margaret, the woman who had spent years returning to a park bench to remember a son who would not return, rose more slowly than she might have once, but with a determined grace. She walked to David and placed her hands on his face, the same face that portraits had framed, now fleshed and real and worn by time. For a heartbeat, they were simply a mother and son in the rawness of their humanity. David lowered his head against her hands, and let the tears come in a way he had not allowed them to in the corridors of tenure and public performance. The sound he made was unpracticed and honest. Amara, who watched near the doorway, felt a swell in her chest as if a wall had been replaced with a window. "You kept the bench," Margaret said, voice cracking with tenderness and sorrow. "You kept the habit of remembering, and for that, you are my refuge." David hugged her then, and the embrace was longer than courtrooms and philanthropy, longer than decisions and podiums. It was a moment that stripped away the sheen of titles and revealed the naked truth beneath. That for all the robes a person can put on, some wounds are simple and human, and some salves are equally simple. Margaret's eyes slid to Amara, who stood like someone who had been given an impossible gift, the gift of witnessing the healing of another. She nodded at Amara with a softness that was like benediction. "You gave me something I thought I had lost," Margaret murmured. "You gave me company." The house made room for that quiet miracle by not making too much of it. People in the room pushed their chores aside and listened to the maternal and filial exchange as something sacred. That night, the staff cleared plates and left a small bowl of biscuits near the room they had used. Even the smallest details became small pillars supporting the larger reconstruction of a family. Afterward, when the room had emptied and the hush that follows a storm settled into the corners, David and Margaret spoke of practicalities, care schedules, privacy, and how the family would protect the elderly matriarch from those who might exploit her. There was talk of audits and new oversight. There was talk of letting Margaret keep her rituals while providing discreet support. Amara stayed until late. The house was quieter then, the portraits seeming to breathe less like sentries and more like keepers of story. She felt as if she had moved from one island of life to another, and each island had been changed by the act of crossing. She thought of how the phrase, "poor black girl comforted a crying old woman," might read to others, an image of small mercy. She had known it already to be more, a doorway. On her way out, Margaret hugged her in a way that conveyed more than words had done all night. "Come back tomorrow," she said, her voice gentle.
"Bring your shawl. Amara promised she would."
Outside, the night air tasted like rain-washed stone. The city seemed different, not in the way the skyline changed, but in the way the shadows softened around the things that had been broken. The emotional reunion was not an ending, it was an invitation to continue rebuilding, a small insistence that people could try again to be kinder to each other. As Amara walked back across the lane, the locket now safely returned to Margaret and the photograph now placed reverently on a mantel, she realized something larger had shifted. An economy of heart had been restored in a corner of the world where wealth had once mistaken distance for care. The poor black girl who had comforted the crying old woman had become a living reminder to a house that its human obligations were not just to its ledger, but to the fragile, imperfect people who lived inside it. It was a quiet victory. It was everything. The house settled into a rhythm of quiet repair. It was not the brash kind of repair that money could buy at once, but the slow, honest mending that comes when people begin to look at one another again. In the days after Margaret's return, Amara found that she had been folded into that repair in ways she had not expected. The foundation offered a practical hand-help with schooling, a modest stipend, and a place to study. But the reward that mattered most was not the contract or the account. It was a different sort of currency: trust. David and William Jr. had meetings and memos to file, but they also had time in the afternoons when boardrooms slept and the sun softened the study windows to listen. They asked Amara what she wanted, not assuming that she needed any one thing. She could have asked for money, for a home, for a new pair of shoes, the kinds of things that would have fixed a single hunger, and called it relief. Instead, Amara asked for tools, education, and a chance to build something that would not belong to one family alone. "I want to learn," she told David in the study, the locket, already a small myth between them, no longer only a relic, but a pivot. "Teach me how to organize programs that reach people who are invisible. Show me how to make a shelter that listens, not a shelter that acts like it already knows everything." David leaned back and let the question weigh on him. There was a certain nobility to the ask, to ask for capacity rather than instant comfort. It changed the shape of the reward. "Then you will have it," he said simply. "We will enroll you in our community outreach program. You will learn logistics, fundraising, outreach, and how to run a small team. We will provide lodging and a living stipend, and I will personally arrange mentorship for the first year." William Jr. added, "We want you to be a visible force in our foundation, not someone who is polished for photographs and then set aside. We need you to help us shape programs that actually honor the dignity of people like Mrs. White." That last sentence struck Amara with a particular heat. It was more than money or opportunity. It was a promise to listen to experience and shape policy around it. It meant the house would no longer think of the bench as only a nostalgic quirk. It meant someone in power had decided to remodel their responses. Amara accepted not out of gratitude alone, but because she had a plan. She would study nonprofit management, learn to write proposals, and when she was ready, she would begin a small initiative that the foundation would seed, a project dedicated to visiting elders in public spaces, offering companionship, and connecting them to the resources they needed. She named it in her mind with humility and a secret hope: the Kind Hearts Project. When the foundation formalized the arrangement, there was, of course, a small celebration. Not the kind with cameras or a gala, but thoughtful gestures. A letter from David offering a modest bursary, a handwritten note from Margaret that called Amara "my reminder," and a key to a small flat above the carriage house that would serve as her base. Even the staff seemed to understand the unspoken symbolism and greeted her with a tenderness that affirmed her belonging. The practicalities of her reward were useful, but the emotional portion was more enduring. David invited her to speak at a small roundtable where the foundation's program directors discussed outreach. He asked her to share her experience in the park, to tell them what warmed Margaret's heart and what had felt like a wound. She spoke plainly, without ceremony, the way Margaret needed privacy, the importance of small rituals, the humanity of listening. The directors listened. Then, slowly at first and then with increasing conviction, they began to shift plans. An outreach van that once ran coldly through city neighborhoods would, under Amara's guidance, become a place people could step into without feeling like they were entering an appointment. Volunteers would be trained to sit without fixing, to offer bread rather than sermons, to respect rituals. The Kind Hearts Project would not be a headline. It would be a practice. For Amara, the reward was not a sudden change in status. She did not become someone else overnight. The city still knew her shoes and her small room, and she still carried her mother's thread bracelet around her wrist. But it changed how she moved through the world. There was a new set of tools at her hands, a small safety net, and the ability to make a visible difference. Her days filled with classes, meetings, and the delicate work of bridging worlds. She learned budgets and grant writing, and she learned to hold a room. She learned that sometimes the hardest work of kindness is expectedly bureaucratic, and that bureaucracy with heart can be transformative. There were moments that tested her resolve, a difficult board member who questioned spending on small programs, the paperwork that could pile up like invisible walls, and the awkwardness of moving freely among people who once lived worlds apart from her. Each time she felt uncertain, she wrapped her fingers around the locket now quietly worn again by Margaret, a simple orbit of silver reminding her of why she had been given the chance. Margaret, for her part, flourished in ways that surprised even the staff who had known her for years. She loved to host small tea times in the staff garden, sitting at a low table with Amara and a few volunteers, tasting tea as if it were a new language. Sometimes she would sit on a bench outside the house and watch the city pass, but always in safety and with someone nearby to greet her if she chose to cross the lane to the public bench. There was a new rhythm to her days. Doctors' visits timed with care, meals shared without audience, and long quiet afternoons where she could be both remembered and free. One evening, as autumn turned the hedges into stained glass and the light in the study slanted lower, David invited Amara to walk the estate with him. They spoke, not as donor and beneficiary, but as two people who had been part of a chain reaction that had altered lives. "You changed something here," David said quietly. "Not because you wanted credit, but because you could not abide by someone being invisible." Amara smiled, feeling both small and enormous. "I only did what felt right," she said. "But if this stays, if the programs hold, then I will be content." David paused, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small sealed envelope. He handed it to her like a man passing on a torch wrapped in paper. Inside was a note and a key. The note was from Margaret. "For the girl who brought me a shawl. Keep being kind." The key was to a small, locked cabinet in the Foundation's office that would be her creative space. A place where she could store notes, small artifacts, and the beginnings of the Kind Hearts Project. Amara clutched it close. The reward that had been given to her had remade more than a single future. It had started a new practice in a house that had once believed the distance of wealth could substitute for tenderness. That, she thought, was the truest reward of all. If the reward was a visible shift, the twist that followed was subtler and colder, the kind of revelation that sneaks into stories like an undertow. It began with a small file a diligent clerk found while doing the routine archival check that William Jr. had insisted upon. The file was not prominent. A misfiled envelope stuck behind invoices, a paper with handwriting that had been thought unimportant. But the city has a way of letting small things become large if someone chooses to look. Amara happened upon the clerk while asking about outreach logistics. He was thumbing through financial statements and stopped when he saw her. There was a look on his face, not alarm exactly, but the kind of puzzled concern that made her understand immediately that something needed to be heard. "Miss Johnson?" he said softly. "Would you mind seeing this?" She took the folder and found that inside were notes, signatures, amounts, and a sequence of transfers that didn't quite line up with the Foundation's usual patterns. The handwriting on one slip matched the smudged ink that had been on the back of the locket's little folded paper, an initial, and a shorthand that someone used when moving funds around surreptitiously. The scrawl seemed to point to a fiduciary routine that suggested misdirection. It turned out that while the family grieved, someone in the inner ring had quietly diverted small sums toward personal ends. Not a single dramatic theft, but small, repeated misallocations that add up like slow erosion. The person responsible had been careful, a quiet hand in the machinery. Paperwork had been bent, and signatures signed with the kind of practiced ignorance that is also a kind of cruelty. When the discovery was made, the household's politeness cracked. Meetings were called. Audits were ordered. People who had once walked the halls like invisible constellations found themselves under inspection. The house which had been learning how to listen now had to learn how to look. David felt the weight of the discovery like a stone pressed to his sternum. Who could do this? He asked one evening, voice raw. It was not merely about the money. It was about the betrayal of trust, the way someone had treated the house and, by extension, Margaret, as a vessel for private gain. William Jr. had a hard, steady look. "We have our suspicions," he told Amara. "There are people who move around in service, and some who move around in council. We are investigating all access points. You are right to keep a record of everything you remember. Small things matter. As they trace signatures, they found not villainy in the classic cinematic sense, no mastermind in a smoke-filled room, but a humdrum ordinariness to the wrong that made it almost worse. A mid-level administrator who had been tempted and rationalized small payments, a distant relative who signed off on an expense that should have gone to a home care provider, an accountant who oversaw ledgers with boredom. The house discovered a network of small compromises rather than a single conspirator. The money had not disappeared into fantastical schemes. It had been siphoned to pay off an extravagant taste here, a quiet gambling debt there, to fund a middle manager's private rooms in modest hotels. The twist carried two blows. One, that the pain Margaret had endured had not only been caused by absence but had been compounded in small ways by corruption, the slow siphoning of dignity under the guise of management. Two, the person who had been thought as trustworthy had been, in fact, the instrument of erosion. The discovery cut across people's faces. Some were shocked, some defensive, and others resigned. The knowledge that institutions are composed of persons who can fail is a hard truth. The foundation decided to act publicly. The misallocated funds would be returned where possible. The culprits would be asked to resign, and the board would instate transparency measures. Legal steps were planned not for vengeance, but for repair. Amara watched the process like someone watching a tide come and go. She felt the small victory of being right, of tending to the small details that others had overlooked. Yet the victory tasted faint. You could repair a ledger, they said, but you could not replace the blur of years where loyalty had gone unexamined. Margaret's response to the twist was both simple and profound. She said with a clarity that made those around her listen, "People are complicated. Let them make whatever amends they can. I forgive them, if they will be better. But my son is not a ledger. He is memory." Her words reshaped the house's fury into purpose. The family, chastened and public-facing now, instituted not only audits, but a small council, which would include people like Amara Voices, who had once been outside the formal conversation. The Kind Hearts Project became the first program to advise on oversight from the perspective of lived experience. The house would now hire external auditors, publish reports, and invite community representatives to consult on spending decisions. There was justice, though slow and legal, and there was also a kind of moral realignment. The person responsible for the siphoning, a mid-level manager who had been used to turning his head and making excuses, was asked to step down. The board issued a statement, and part of the funds were recovered. But more importantly, the house took steps to prevent such quiet erosion in the future. Amara felt strange satisfaction. It was not the gloating kind. It was the kind you feel when a wrong is righted and a system decides to become less complacent. Margaret, for her part, forgave in a way that taught the house humility. She insisted that the house's response be measured and oriented toward care, not simply punishment. "Punish if you must," she said gently, "but make sure the people who need help get it first." In the weeks that followed, the house's public image shifted from a fortress of aloofness to something a little softer. A house that had made mistakes and then chosen clumsily but sincerely to repair them. The twist had revealed human flaws, but also opened a space for accountability and, ultimately, growth. And for Amara, the twist confirmed a lesson her mother had given her. Small gestures matter because they can reveal what is hidden. Small questions asked with humility can turn the tide. The locket's tiny folded paper had been a sliver of a map. Her tenderness had been the first step in a chain that exposed rot and invited reform. That night, when the house had settled and the staff had gone home, Amara walked to the public bench where it had all begun. The bench was empty, a modest anchor in a city of changing tides. She placed a single white flower there, folded and simple, and she felt the city breathe around her like a held breath, finally released. Resolution arrived quietly, the kind of ending that does not shout, but that settles like warm light through a small window. In the months after the twist, life rearranged itself into a gentler pattern. The house continued its oversight. The foundation launched transparent reports. The Kind Hearts Project hired volunteers in small vans that no longer felt clinical but more like mobile sitting rooms. It was not a fairy tale where all is perfect. It was a world where people tried harder. Amara's days filled with work that mattered. She taught volunteers to sit with elders without the compulsion to fix everything. She organized small neighborhood meetups, taught workshops on grant writing for grassroots organizers, and helped Margaret plan gentle garden afternoons where neighbors and staff could mingle. She often carried a thermos, of tea and a bag of fresh bread gestures that had once been small gestures of survival and now were ingredients of a practice. The news of Margaret's return and the Kind Hearts Project spread slowly. In the kind way good things often move. With word of mouth, with a volunteer's story, and with a retired teacher who found an afternoon of company to be the most remarkable medicine. The Foundation's modest publicity helped, but it was the tangible acts of volunteer reading aloud, a teenager sitting with a woman who once taught sewing, someone bringing a chessboard to a bench that turned curiosity into community. Margaret became a beloved presence in both worlds, a fixture at Wellington House who sometimes walked across the lane to sit on the public bench, always with a small knit shawl or a volunteer by her side. She kept the photograph of William in a drawer reachable and sometimes showed it to a newcomer, telling a short, affectionate story that made people lean in. Her voice, which had once trembled with years of private grief, found steadier notes. She laughed more easily. Sometimes she would take Amara's hand and call her "my reminder," and those two words were the quiet currency of her gratitude. One afternoon, as a low sun gilded the city, David invited Amara to the fountain in front of Wellington House. He carried with him a small box, the same deliberate, understated manner that had guided much of the house's change. "We have planted something," he said, "not only with funds and structure, but with people who care." Inside the box was a small slip of paper with a sentence that David read aloud, "For those who bring back what is lost." He explained that the Foundation had committed to sustaining the Kind Hearts Project for 5 years, to provide seed money and oversight, and to partner with community groups across the city. David said it plainly, with a humility that had become his companion. "We are stewards now. We were not good ones before." Amara felt the gentle gravity of the moment. The reward she had received had multiplied into something that reached beyond her own life and into a city that, like any other, had gaps it could not always see. She thought, too, of how precarious progress can be. The Foundation's new policies could be reversed, volunteers could lose momentum, and people could forget. So she set about building redundancies. Volunteer training documents, a small endowment group, and a mentorship program tying experienced elders to young volunteers. She wrote proposals, held meetings in the carriage house room that she had come to love, and, most importantly, she taught others how to listen. Months bled into a year. The Kind Hearts Project ran its first formal program. Weekly bench visits across neighborhoods, companion phone lines, and small monthly gatherings that offered hot soup and better-than-expected conversation. People who felt invisible began to reappear in their neighborhoods with new small rituals. A paper by the bench, a chessboard, a calendar of birthdays that someone remembered. There were setbacks, of course. Bureaucracy crept like ivy, volunteers dropped out, a funding cycle tightened. But the habit had begun. The city's stories began to include tales of benches with company, small vans whose doors were always open for tea, and a family that had learned how to look beyond ledgers. Amara's life changed, but did not erase her past. She visited the market stall she used to pass and left a packet of bread with the chestnut vendor. She took the occasional walk down the lane where the city's old tenements hummed. She still wore her mother's thread bracelet beneath her sleeve as an anchor. Her scholarship classes occasionally frustrated her, but each one was a new skill folded into her practice. One golden evening, years after that first rainy bench, Amara walked into the park and found a little cluster of people gathered where Margaret had once sat alone. They were an unlikely congregation: a retired postal worker, a college student with a guitar, a young mother, an elderly woman with metallic hands, and a boy with a bag of seeds. They were sharing bread like old friends. On the bench, a small plaque had been placed, not ostentatious but tender, "In memory of small mercies, for those who stay." Amara sat quietly and watched, and then, because she could not help herself, she took off her own shawl and wrapped it around the elderly woman next to her. The circle laughed and passed bread. It was an ordinary miracle, a city practicing kindness in increments. That night, when the lamps softened and the park exhaled its daily breath, Margaret visited the bench for a short spell. She looked older and yet more peaceful than Amara had ever seen her. She touched the little plaque with a finger and then took Amara's hand. "You kept your promise," she said. "You multiplied kindness." Amara thought of everything that had happened: the rain, the locket, the house, the twist, and the slow mending of what had been frayed. She did not pretend it had been easy. She did not pretend she had been heroic. She had only been human, listening when people forgot to speak and holding the small things as if they mattered. The story that others would later tell, the headline-like phrase that once framed the moment, would be accurate only in its bones. Yes, a poor black girl comforted a crying old woman, but the truth beneath that headline was larger. A chain of simple acts wound into the possibility of societal change. A shawl given in the rain did not just warm a shoulder, it rewired a house, reshaped a foundation, and taught a city something small and vital. That dignity is maintained not by distance, but by attendance. And so the resolution was not a single dramatic scene, but a continuing practice daily. Humble, persistent. Amara kept teaching, running programs, and going to her classes. Margaret kept telling the story of her son in a voice that no longer staggered with rawness, but carried the steady rhythm of remembered love. David kept looking, and William Jr. kept auditing, and the house kept learning to be less defensive and more open. Years later, when people asked Amara about that rainy day, she would smile and say simply, "I had a shawl and some bread." The humility of the answer made people laugh and then think. In the end, that was all it took to set a chain in motion. The world changed not because of a single act, but because people chose to listen to the small things it had to say.